Okay, hi everybody. So welcome back. So we're going to be continuing our discussion of Claude Lévi-Strauss today and his structuralism ideas, which, they can be hard to wrap your head around, even for people who've studied it a long time, because he is the kind of French theoretical writer who really likes to write in a confusing, almost sort of game-playing way. So that's one of the challenges with him. But I think if we look at a few different examples and we kind of revisit his work, we can hopefully make the kind of stuff he's talking about more clear. What I want to do first today is revisit his analysis of Oedipus, just kind of go through that one more time, and also talk about where is this story of Oedipus coming from, and are there different angles that we could take with it. I had you guys read a bit of Oedipus from the book, not the whole play, but some of the play. And so we'll use that to give us a little bit more insight there. Okay, so let's go back and take a look at that chart from Tuesday. All right, so this is our chart, and I'm going to zoom in actually so that we can get a better look at it. Okay, so if you'll recall, Lévi-Strauss's method basically goes like this. 1, read the myth. 2, make a list of different events or details in the myth, and those he calls mythemes. Number 3, make a chart of your mythemes. And Lévi-Strauss actually imagined them as all being on different cards. So these different entries here, he would have them on different note cards on his floor, and then he would arrange them, which is a pretty cute image actually. And if you want to try that yourself, maybe that will be useful to you. So what he did is he arranged it in a way so topics are the columns here. So we have topics 1, 2, 3, 4, and then everything else kind of goes roughly by time going on down the list here, starting off from Oedipus's most distant ancestor Cadmus, who founded the city of Thebes, all the way to Oedipus's descendant Antigone. So basically the whole story there. And again, it's important to remember that Lévi-Strauss says that you should see myths as interrelated and interconnected. So for him, the real thing to analyze is not just the one story of the guy who killed his father and married his mother, but all the other stories that are connected to it. And maybe the question for you guys is, which stories should be included in this? Should we include all the stories about Zeus? Should we include all the stories about Thebes? Should we just include the stories about this one family? Or should we limit it down to just the particular events of the story about Oedipus? It's an open question, and maybe you guys have different interpretations there. But what Lévi-Strauss emphasizes are 4 categories here. One of them involves being too loyal to your family members in some way or another. Cadmus seeks his sister, even though Zeus has taken her, and he's not supposed to go against Zeus. Oedipus marries his own mother, and Antigone buries her brother despite the new king, her uncle, telling her not to, that her brother is a criminal and an enemy of the government. So she's not supposed to. So all these fit into a category of loving your family too much. Whereas these ones involve family members killing each other. We have the Spartoi, who are these warriors made from dragon's teeth planted in the ground. You've got Oedipus killing his father, and you've got brother killing brother. Then category 3, you've got monsters that come in from the earth being slain by heroes. We've got the dragon killed by Cadmus, and we've got the Sphinx killed by Oedipus. And then finally, in category number 4, we have names that refer in some way to damaged feet or walking with a limp. We have Labdicus, meaning the lame one, the one who is disabled in some way. Laius, lefty, favors his left side. And Oedipus, swollen foot. So here's how Lévi-Strauss analyzes this. He says that these categories are opposites. And so his step number 4 after making a chart is to look for opposites within his categories. So the opposites here are killing your family versus loving your family too much, loving your family not enough versus loving your family too much, in other words, and killing monsters that come from the earth versus having damaged feet. And if we'll remember, this is where Levi-Strauss does a big sort of logical leap, which is he argues that having damaged feet is a sign in mythology that someone was born from the earth. And I kind of think he should put the Spartoi were born in this category because the Spartoi are warriors that come from the earth. And Greek mythology has a lot of figures that are like founders of cities that are born from the earth. So we have a conflict between bad things come from the earth and they should be killed versus good things come from the earth, such as people. And so where we get into here, what Levi-Strauss argues is that this part of the story is about a conflict between the idea that humans come from the earth and are just sort of born spontaneously from one parent, not from two parents. Whereas in this category, we would say only monsters come from the earth. And so human beings are born the normal way. They don't go into those stories where someone is born from the earth if you just go by this category. And, you know, notice that Levi-Strauss is drawing on a lot of other mythology, a lot of other Greek mythology. So that's maybe a strength or a weakness of this chart. He says everything's connected, but there's some stuff he hasn't put on this chart, and he just kind of, you know, wants us to know about, or he tells us because he knows it about Greek mythology. So it's kind of tricky there. I do think it's true, though, that we do have a lot of stories in Greek mythology about people being born from the earth. And Levi-Strauss says that these two categories are opposites. Humans are born normally and slay monsters, versus humans are born from the earth like the monsters. He says basically that this opposition gives us anxiety. It stresses us the heck out because we know it's a paradox. Where did humans come from? Where do babies come from? Do they come from parents or do they come from the earth? You can't have both of those things at the same time. But what you can have is a way of reconciling loving your family too much versus loving your family too little. So what's in between loving your family too much and loving your family too little? It's having a normal family life. And so Oedipus is a counter-example, or like an example of someone who fits into both extreme categories. And so he is kind of merging both categories. So he is also something that is in between because he has both. You could have both loving your family too much and loving your family too little, or you could have neither. And so the story of Oedipus kind of suggests to us, let's try and get something in between being too extreme in either direction. So Oedipus could be described as a mediating figure, a figure that is in between. And we can also say that the idea of a normal family life, which Oedipus can't have, that is also a mediating figure that is in between. And then Levi-Strauss goes on to say that this pair of opposites is like this pair of opposites. So the fact that there's something in between this pair of opposites makes us feel like there's something in between this pair of opposites, being born from the earth versus not born from the earth. And so it reassures us that everything's going to be okay. Even though we can't see a way to understand this paradox of earth versus not earth, we can see a way to understand this paradox of family murder versus incest. And so that means that we feel like we understand it all, even when we don't. And so that calms us down in the back of our mind and makes mythology less stressful. In other words, you could say it's a way of, you know, dealing with the fact that mythology is so paradoxical and contradictory, is you find the things in it that aren't that contradictory or that make sense to us in our normal everyday lives, and you accept those. But one thing I think that Levi-Strauss doesn't fully explore here is that there's also a conflict in all this between like normal reproduction versus abnormal reproduction. And so instead of making this category all about the damaged feet, which doesn't entirely, I mean, we don't, historians and mythologists wouldn't say for sure that that damaged feet equals coming from the earth thing is 100% clear. So instead of doing that, we could talk about normal reproduction versus abnormal reproduction. And so maybe we want to say, that we have abnormal reproduction in the form of incest versus abnormal reproduction in the form of being born from the earth, like the Spartoi are, the earth monsters and the earth people. And so maybe we want to put an emphasis on those categories instead of the categories that Levi-Strauss does. I don't know. You could take this in a lot of different directions. Levi-Strauss's interpretation is just one interpretation. But he says that there's a conflict between the idea of born from one versus born from two. So like born from one earth, one parent, or just sort of cloned reproduction, something like that, versus the idea of two parents. And so I think there's something you could make out of the fact that this story is all about Oedipus's two parents. He is wondering, is he born from the family that he thinks is his family, or is he born from the family that he, comes across along the way? So maybe there's different ways to interpret this, and I kind of wish Levi-Strauss explored that side of things a little bit more, this idea of, I guess, normal reproduction versus abnormal reproduction. So I'm going to switch over to a Word document here. If we look at that, his big theme is incest versus family murder and earth monsters versus earth-born people. Those are the opposites that he identifies, but I think you can actually identify some other opposites within the story as well. And I wonder if we could use them to look at this story using some of Levi-Strauss's methods, but maybe in a different way. The one I was just thinking of was abnormal versus normal reproduction / family life, I guess. I think that's kind of a theme in there too. And I think even if we don't go into Levi-Strauss's exact pattern, I think we could say that these stories are about relieving the anxiety by showing you what is the way to do things. The way to do things is to have the normal family life. And so the mediator, I'll mention this, the mediator is Oedipus / normal family life. And the same goes for the category of normal versus abnormal reproduction. Now, even though Oedipus doesn't have a normal life, he kind of implies the existence of one by, being so out there in the extremes. His story, you might say, allows us to think about both options and to say, wait a minute, Oedipus, I know what you should do, and that's what I'm going to do, even though you couldn't do that. So what I want to do is I want to look a bit more at the story of Oedipus, and where does this all come from? Okay, so Levi-Strauss, says that we should actually look at lots of different versions of each myth because there's no one true interpretation. That was something early mythologists got hung up on. They were trying to find the one story that all the others were descended from. And the thing is, you just can't do it. History is so murky, and there's so many different versions of mythology, especially when it has room for ambiguity and multiple interpretations, like a lot of polytheistic mythology is. So there's multiple versions of the story. But I think the one that most people focus on for Oedipus, and the one that kind of influences our perspective, is the way it's told by Sophocles. And his play is called King Oedipus, or Oedipus the King. So Sophocles is a playwright writing one of these ancient Athenian plays. And this is the play that I had you guys read a little bit of. And so his play is the story of Oedipus, but it's one day, one really bad day in Oedipus's life. Some thinkers, some people who talked and wrote about Greek plays back in Greek times thought that plays should only take place over the course of one day. You'd have a story that's just told almost in real time. And so that's how Sophocles goes about it, is he shows one day in Oedipus's life. And this is the day where he finds out just how much has gone wrong. because we don't try to tell the story of once upon a time there was Oedipus and he left his home and then he killed a guy and then he married a lady and then he found out they were his mother and father. No, we actually tell the story of that discovery. So we just focus it to the day that Oedipus found out the truth, which, is a pretty important day to talk about. So, and the play opens with a mystery. Where did the plague come from? During this time, Oedipus is king, so he's in charge. He's the king of Thebes now, so he's in charge of the city of Thebes. And Thebes is suffering a terrible disease that's killing a whole bunch of people. And the ancient Greek thought process is to think about, okay, what person did something wrong to be punished by the gods? So the city is being punished for some reason because someone in the city has done something evil. There's a lot of ideas in Greek mythology of like contamination or, being impure in some way. If you haven't purified yourself to get right for the gods, and if you do something evil, like commit a murder or incest or something like that, that would definitely be a time to get purified. So Oedipus is the king, and he wants to know who in the city is responsible for this, because he's like, I'm gonna have words with them. I'm gonna kill or arrest whoever is responsible for causing this plague, whoever is responsible for making the gods mad at us. Of course, he doesn't know that it's himself. And anyone who is going to see this play would have actually known the story of Oedipus. That's the thing about these Greek plays. They were usually telling stories that everybody knew, but they might be surprised by the different playwrights' versions of the details, because everybody had their own different way of telling the story. Other authors who told the story were the playwright Euripides. We'd like to know more. We don't have the full version of that play. And Homer in the Odyssey and the Iliad alludes to the story. So these would be some of the different versions you could look at. But Sophocles puts the emphasis on this plague as this story of, Oedipus is going to solve the mystery and find the plague. He's investigating. And so he calls the prophet Tiresias. Tiresias is a wise old man, is a blind seer. So Tiresias can see prophecies and tell the future, but Tiresias is actually blind. And it said that Tiresias had a strange relationship with the gods where they both punished him and rewarded him. So he was given the gift of prophecy, but he was also made blind. And so Tiresias knows the truth. So Tiresias comes in, Oedipus calls in Tiresias, and Tiresias says, well, actually, it's you who caused all this. And Oedipus gets really mad. He says, you were trying to trick me. You were part of a conspiracy trying to overthrow me. Tiresias is blind, but he can see the truth. And Oedipus is able to see, but he is blind to the truth. And so he sends Tiresias away. He gets paranoid. He thinks that he's trying to destroy him, even though he's just trying to tell him the truth. And then eventually Oedipus encounters, he talks a little bit more to his wife about her husband's disappearance and finds out the truth of that story. And then he finds the shepherd who took him as a baby and took him to the other city of Corinth, where he was raised by people he thought were his parents. And he finds out the truth that they weren't his parents, and he finds out where the baby came from. It was from right here in Thebes, and so it all comes crashing down. Jocasta, Oedipus's wife, kills herself out of shame and self-loathing, and Oedipus blinds himself. He, gouges his eyes out. And then at the end of the play, we see him going off, being led by his daughter/sister off to wander the land. And in other plays, we see the story of Oedipus wandering around until he finally sort of mysteriously disappears, maybe goes to join the gods in some way. So if we look at this story, what are some other themes that we could pull out of here? Well, if we're making a list, we can imagine making a list like Levi-Strauss is doing of different moments in the story that point towards this. But we could also, maybe we'll skip straight to the opposites here. One of them would be blindness versus sight, and also kind of light being associated with sight here. So, on the one hand, we have, Tiresias, and then Oedipus at end. Then on the other one, we have the chorus of the play is constantly talking about light, and Oedipus at the start can see, and he's always talking about shedding a light on the mystery. He's trying to investigate the dark and figure out the truth. We have truth and light and sight being all treated as the same thing versus blindness and ignorance and lack of knowledge all being treated as the same thing. So maybe we could also make it, blindness is to sight as ignorance is to knowledge, something like that. So I'll put that down too. Ignorance versus knowledge. We tend to treat those as the same thing as blindness versus sight, which is just a part of our culture, but it's worth thinking about why that is. And in between, we have a mediator figure, and that's again Oedipus, because he goes over the course of the play from one extreme to the other. So he changes over time, and it touches both things. So that makes him a pretty good mediating figure for all of this. And he makes the story work, and he makes us understand how this all happened. And we can kind of understand it better, the difference between ignorance versus knowledge. That'd be the way to think about blindness versus sight, I think. But there's other directions we could take this as well. We could talk about male versus female in this story. Because Oedipus has this sort of violent relationship with men, and the men in the story get into fights and kill each other, and Oedipus kills his old father. But Oedipus's mother killed herself by suicide, and in some versions of the story, as you guys mentioned, the Sphinx kills herself by suicide. So we could say there are, male responses to problems versus female responses to problems. That's how the Greeks are thinking about them anyway. Violence towards others versus violence towards self. The way this play actually works, I should mention that these plays are actually kind of musical performances. And that's something that gets lost because we just read the writing. We read the lyrics because we don't have the notes that they would have sung. But these were performances. They had songs, they had dances in the middle of them. And that was the job of the chorus, which was a group of people who would, sing out the voice of the crowd, the voice of the common people, or the voice of, any kind of group, but sort of speaking for the story more than for one individual character. And they, inherently in these plays is sort of individuals versus community, because the chorus always stands for the community, and there's never any more than 3 actors on stage at the same time. There's a limit of 3, and sometimes it's just 2. But there's only really 3 performers who are like the soloists in these plays. And they represent the characters like Jocasta and Oedipus. They're all men, even when they're playing women characters, which is interesting. But we have individuals like Tiresias, Jocasta, and Oedipus, and then maybe one of them will swap out and start being the shepherd instead of the character. But that kind of suggests this individuals versus community thing going on just in all Greek plays, but I think we could argue in this one, Oedipus is this leader. He's supposed to be the leader of the community. Is he doing right by them? Well, no, there's this plague, and it's all his fault. So, ask who is responsible for the plague. It's him. That's very worth thinking about. And he is showing himself to be a bad leader here in a way. Um, and then there's the way the sets are set up. Uh, this one just takes place outside of Oedipus's palace. So they're just kind of hanging out outside of Oedipus's house, and it's very simple. It's not elaborate at all. Um, but there's a real, they use it very cleverly by putting an emphasis on inside versus outside. So characters go in the house, that's the place where Jocasta kills herself, where Oedipus's crimes of incest happen, where his authority rests, versus outside is where he finds out the truth. He finds out, he talks to the shepherd and he learns about the whole story of his existence, and he learns about the fight that he had with his father, and all of this like sort of bad stuff happening outside the house, but also um, bad stuff happening inside the house. So it's not quite, inside is good or outside is good or anything like that, but different kinds of things happen. It seems like more, the world is outside, the exposure of the truth is outside. So it could be, again, a pattern that maps onto that ignorance versus knowledge type of thing. So yeah, so these would all be directions I think you could analyze this in if you were putting the emphasis like Levi-Strauss does on opposites. Yeah, and that's the main thing I wanted to emphasize. And if you want to bring the other Thebes stories, the other family of Oedipus stories into the story as well, you could do that. You could talk about what is their ignorance versus their knowledge, what is their power versus the community type of stuff. I think you could go in a lot of different directions with these. And Levi-Strauss suggests, starting with just events and making lists of them as a way to just figure out what's there in the myth. And I think, maybe he is pushing a little bit too much towards his own preordained conclusion with the myth. But you don't have to necessarily. On the other hand, you could also just, jump straight to the opposites and then try to find things in the story that emphasize those opposites. Okay, I think I'm going to end the video here. That's all I have to say about Oedipus, but let's get back to some of the other examples of this and see if we can see how we can apply Levi-Strauss's ideas in a big, broader way to talk about other things, other Greek myths especially.